do have a name.
My name is Gladiator.
Today, we're taking a look at some pretty compelling source material. It brings into sharp focus some significant concerns raised about Indonesia's health sovereignty.
And claims of foreign intervention in its national health system, right?
Exactly. We're primarily digging into excerpts from a video recording. It's a public discussion forum featuring, among others, a former Indonesian Minister of Health.
Mm-hmm.
And this material, well, it lays out a very specific viewpoint on these critical issues.
Got it.
So our mission is to unpack the key claims, the historical context they present, specific modern examples, and the detailed perspectives from these sources.
So you have a clear understanding of what's actually being argued here.
Precisely. Okay, let's unpack this.
What's really striking, I think, is how directly the source confronts the issue, like right from the very beginning.
How so?
It starts with this really fundamental principle.
Yeah.
That health shouldn't be treated as a commodity, something to be traded, especially not by a nation that's responsible for its own people.
And it sounds like it comes with a serious warning, too.
Oh, absolutely. The source asserts that health could be used as the finishing touch, like the final method to paralyze a nation.
Wow. So the perspective presented is basically that countries have to maintain their sovereignty no matter what.
Exactly. They must not allow foreign interests to dictate their health policies. That's the core message there.
Okay.
And the material frames this whole effort to achieve what it calls pro-rakyat, which means pro-people health as, well, an essential struggle, a fight to save the nation.
Which it sees as being in danger.
In a very critical state, according to the source. It even makes this particularly strong claims, and I quote, selling the country.
That's quite an accusation. So what's the takeaway message from that part?
It's simple and powerful. Law one, fight back.
Okay. Fight back. And the source doesn't just see this as a current problem, right? It connects it to the past.
Right. It argues this pattern, this potential for foreign influence, has deep historical roots. It draws a very clear parallel back to 1998.
The agreement between President Suharto and the IMF.
Exactly. According to this material, that agreement contained conditions that really hit Indonesia's economic sovereignty hard.
And, importantly for our topic,
it led to the liberalization of the public sector, and that included health. The claim is basically that specific event sort of opened the door for foreign intervention in domestic policy.
I see. And the source is saying this is happening again now.
That's the assertion. It claims this pattern is repeating, and it specifically points to events during the COVID-19 pandemic as evidence for that.
Okay, so this historical link, it kind of sets the stage for the specific, more modern examples that are detailed in the source material.
It does. And one key example the source really highlights is a Memorandum of Understanding, an OU.
Right.
This was apparently signed between the Indonesia government and the Gates Foundation during the COVID-19 period.
And the purpose of this MOU, according to the source?
It was specifically aimed at the transformation of the national health system. That's what the source claims.
Okay. And did the source point to any specific implementations that came out of this?
It points to two in particular that it claims stemmed from this collaboration. First, the release of millions of Wolbachia mosquitoes.
The project to tackle dengue fever. I remember hearing about that.
Yes. And the source specifically notes that this project faced protests. Why? Because of what it calls a lack of informed consent, particularly from the general public who were, directly impacted.
Okay, that's one example. What was the second?
The second one cited is ongoing collaboration with the Gates Foundation on TBC tuberculosis vaccine trials.
And the concerns there?
Well, the source states these trials raise pretty significant concerns. Things like transparency, the ethics involved in the clinical trials themselves, safety considerations, and ultimately that core issue, again, national health sovereignty.
And it seems the source ties this back to history again.
It does. It makes an explicit reference back to Bung Karno's famous phrase, "Go to hell with your aid."
Suggesting that kind of defiance is needed again today.
That's the implication, that this historical stance is, just as relevant now when facing what it sees as foreign pressures.
Building on that, the source makes a really bold claim about the WHO, doesn't it?
Extremely bold. It claims that nearly all 99% according to the material of foreign intervention in national health policy, happens via the World Health Organization.
99%. That's quite a statement.
It is.
Yeah.
And a central, very detailed part of the source is the personal testimony from the former Minister of Health we mentioned earlier.
About her own experiences.
Yes, specifically about her fight, as she describes it, with the WHO during the avian flu pandemic back in 2005.
Okay, what did her account say?
Well, as presented in the source, it begins with her challenging WHO's initial communication. She claims they spread misinformation by saying transmission was only from dead chickens to humans.
Which her research contradicted.
That's what she claims, yes. Then, she says WHO epidemiologists started asserting that human-to-human transmission was happening in Indonesia.
But her data didn't support that.
According to her account, no. She says her ministry's virus sequencing found no markers for it.
So, based on her testimony in the source, what did she do?
Well, she claims that because she felt WHO staff activities were actually endangering the nation, she eventually ordered them out of Indonesia.
Ordered WHO staff out. That's a significant step.
It certainly is. And she also recounts her attempts later to reform WHO's protocols. She apparently proposed that these virus sharing frameworks, like GIN and GISN.
Global Influenza Network and Surveillance Network.
Right. She argued they should be governed by international law. She specifically claimed GISN was allegedly under U.S. jurisdiction. And the source points out that these bigger global discussions around things like material transfer agreements, MTA, and pathogen access and benefit sharing, PBS, how countries share virus samples and maybe benefit from the research.
Yeah, those are still really tricky issues.
Exactly. They remain globally unresolved, especially now with all the discussions around the new pandemic agreement.
And there was one more really striking claim she made about the avian flu vaccine, wasn't there?
Yes, a really critical one, according to the source material. She claims that even though Indonesia had the most cases and deaths from avian flu at the time, the WHO actually prevented the country from developing and making its own vaccine.
Prevented them. Wow.
That's the claim made in the source.
Okay. Here's where it gets really interesting. This former minister's experience, her investigation, the source says she uncovered something specific, a mechanism.
Yes, exactly. This part of the source details what she claims is a concerning path, a kind of pipeline that Indonesian virus samples took.
Okay, trace that path for us according to the source.
According to her account, samples sent from Indonesia to WHO allegedly went first to GISN, which, again, the source states is under U.S. jurisdiction.
Right.
From there, supposedly they went to the CDC in Atlanta. Then, potentially, on to big pharma companies.
For what purpose?
Ultimately, for vaccine production. That's the alleged pipeline.
And there was another claim about the data itself.
Even more alarming, yes. She states in the source that the data from her ministry's virus sequencing was sent to Los Alamos.
The place linked to atomic bomb development?
The very same. The source notes, and then also to Pago. The source claims this raises serious concerns about the potential for developing bioweapons from this information.
That's a very heavy accusation.
Extremely. And it leads to this powerful and frankly disturbing assertion from the source. It claims vaccines don't really sell well unless there's a pandemic or an epidemic.
Implying that such events could potentially be created.
That's the suggestion made in the source material. And this alleged pipeline, according to the former minister's account, isn't presented as just some theory. She claims it's a real conspiracy she personally faced and uncovered.
Okay, moving forward in time then to the COVID-19 period, the source takes a very controversial stance here, doesn't it?
Extremely controversial. It argues that COVID-19 shouldn't be classified as a pandemic at all.
Not a pandemic. What then?
It labels it bioterrorism.
Bioterrorism. What's the reasoning given in the source for that?
It's quite specific. The source argues that a true pandemic, according to the original 2005 International Health Regulations, has to originate from documented animal-to-human transmission.
And the source claims that wasn't found for COVID-19.
It claims that definitive origin was never established. Instead, the source presents the view that the virus was actually a leak from a lab in Wuhan.
A lab leak.
Yes. And it goes further, alleging this lab was funded and guided by the U.S., and it specifically mentions Dr. Fauci in this context.
Okay. And how does the source describe the global response to COVID?
It uses the term psychoterrorism,
yes,
referring to, the spread of fear.
Mm-hmm.
It also criticizes what it calls illogical restrictions, like lockdowns.
Linking them to ongoing economic problems.
Exactly. It claims these measures have led to ongoing global economic hardship that were well, still feeling today.
And who does the source identify as being behind this alleged plan?
It asserts the masterminds were non-state actors. It explicitly names the Gates Foundation.
So not governments initially.
It suggests even powerful governments, like the U.S. and China, actually became initial victims of this alleged plan orchestrated by these non-state actors.
That's a complex picture. The source also expresses strong views on the vaccines themselves, particularly the mRNA ones.
Profound concerns, yes. Specifically about mRNA vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna, it claims they are dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Well, it states, referencing unnamed U.S. sources, it's important to note that these vaccines are allegedly being discontinued by the CDC.
Discontinued.
And that they are not permitted, according to these claims, for children or pregnant women. Again, we have to stress these are claims presented within the source material we're examining.
Understood. And the source goes into the mechanism of mRNA technology.
It does. This perspective claims that mRNA technology has the potential to sort of dictate human DNA to continuously produce spike proteins.
Continuously.
That's the claim.
Yeah.
And it cites recent research, apparently spanning 17 months, that it claims found spike proteins present in heart and brain cells long after vaccination.
The source also presents some specific data, doesn't it, from autopsies?
Yes, it presents specific percentages from what it states is U.S. autopsy data on individuals who were vaccinated against COVID-19.
What kind of findings does it list?
It lists quite concerning figures: 49% cardiovascular issues, 17% blood clots, 11% respiratory problems, 7% multi-organ issues, 4% nervous system issues, plus it mentions claims of autoimmune problems as well.
And again, this is data presented as cited in the source material.
Correct. And it contrasts this purported U.S. data with the situation in Indonesia.
How so?
The source claims that in Indonesia, data on vaccine side effects is poor, or that when adverse events happen, victims aren't having them attributed to the vaccines.
I see. And there's a related concern about Indonesian capability.
Yes, concern is raised in the source about biopharma. That's the Indonesian state-owned pharmaceutical company learning mRNA technology.
Why is that a concern from the source's perspective?
Because of the potential for future mRNA vaccine trials in Indonesia for diseases like malaria and TBC, which the source claims could be linked to the Gates Foundation and another company called Biante.
Okay. So after laying all this out, the history, the personal accounts, the specific examples, the vaccine concerns, what does this all mean according to the source? How does it tie together?
Well, the material attempts to map out a kind of global structure that it claims is driving all these issues.
The global power structure.
Essentially, yes. It asserts that global health, and it broadens this to humanity itself, is currently controlled by what it calls an exploitative hegemony.
And it identifies this hegemony.
It does. It identifies it as the Global Public-Private Partnership, or GPPP. A group, it says, meets every year in Davos.
Okay, the GPPP. And what does the source claim this group does?
According to this perspective, the GPPP is made up of private companies and NGOs, and it claims they actively create and regulate global policy.
How do they supposedly do that?
The source suggests they achieve this influence over governments and state institutions primarily through health interventions. Pandemic vaccination policies are cited as a prime example.
But not just health.
No. The source claims their influence extends much wider into climate change policy, the economy, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, technology, infrastructure, a whole range of areas.
That's a huge scope of alleged influence. Does the source break down how the structure supposedly works?
It provides a pretty detailed breakdown of this alleged structure. At the very top, it places the policymakers or think tanks.
Who does it list there?
Organizations it sees as highly influential: the WEF, the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, Chatham House, and the Rockefeller Organization.
Okay, the think tanks at the top. What's below them?
Below them in this model are the operators or distributors.
Mm-hmm.
These are the entities that supposedly carry out the policies.
Like who?
Entities like the UN, the IMF, the IPCC, the World Bank, the WHO, naturally. Also, influential philanthropists Bill Gates is specifically mentioned again, along with global corporations and various NGOs.
And there was an interesting side note there.
Yes, the source includes a sort of positive comment mentioning that USAID was disbanded by Trump, fitting it into this structure somehow.
Right. So these policies are created, distributed. Then what happens according to the source?
They flow down to the recipients at the national level. This layer includes national governments, ministers, cabinets, specific ministries like health, education, culture.
But also other parts of the state?
Yes, the police, the military, the courts, local government, parliament, the legal system itself. The source claims implementation often relies on specific individuals within these institutions. It uses the term ognum, who it alleges silence opposing scientific viewpoints.
Ognum. And there are structures within countries that support this, according to the source.
Yes, it identifies supporting structures. This includes selected scientific institutions. It specifically mentions Indonesian universities like ITB and UI in the context of facilitating trials. Professional organizations like IDI, the Indonesian Medical Association, which the source claims might be affected. Various laboratories. Researchers who the source even suggests can be paid to produce specific results. And foreign policy supporters are also listed here.
Okay, so you have policy flowing down supported by these structures. How is it spread to the public?
Through what the source labels propagandists, this layer is quite broad.
Give us some examples.
Mainstream media outlets, TV, newspapers, radio, magazines, but also social media platforms, buzzers, influencers, and, interestingly, fact-checkers.
Fact-checkers as propagandists.
The source claims they're used to label truth as hoaxes. It also mentions anonymous accounts used, it says, to spread disinformation.
And who's the ultimate target of all this, in the source's view?
The general public. The rakyat kecil, or common people, they are claimed to be the objects of these policies.
How are they exploited, according to this view?
Through various costs, taxes, inflation, but critically, through the debt the nation incurs to fund these programs. So the argument is, essentially, policies cooked up by this global structure get pushed down and implemented within nations like Indonesia, and the public bears the cost.
That's quite a comprehensive and concerning picture the source paints. Given all that, does it propose any solutions, any steps Indonesia should take?
It does. It proposes specific actions Indonesia should take to, as it puts it, reclaim or strengthen its sovereignty and health.
Okay, what are those proposed steps?
It outlines 4 key ones. First, reject the pandemic agreement before 2026. The source claims this agreement would revoke national sovereignty.
Reject the pandemic agreement. What's second?
Second, withdraw from the amendments to the International Health Regulations, the IHR 2005. It says withdraw before July 19th, claiming these amendments have already been enacted by WHO.
Withdraw from the IHR amendments. Okay, third.
Third, abolish mandatory vaccination laws. The source specifically points to Indonesia's Omnibus Law on Health, UU Kesehatan 17/2023.
Why abolish them?
Because that law apparently imposes fines or even prison for refusal. The source argues very strongly that people should not be forced to vaccinate, especially if they have contraindications or if the vaccines themselves are claimed to be useless or harmful.
No forced vaccination. And the fourth step.
Fourth, basically return health policy decision-making, so it aligns strictly with the principles and the preamble of Indonesia's 1945 constitution.
Meaning focusing on?
Protecting the nation, promoting general welfare, things like that, and crucially, explicitly rejecting any foreign dictates or interests, even if they come disguised as WHO guidance.
Reject foreign dictates. So 4 clear steps proposed.
Yes. And the source concludes this section by expressing hope that Indonesia's current president, Prabowo, who it claims aligns with those 1945 Constitution principles, will actually adopt these steps.
But it suggests he'd need support.
It emphasizes he would need significant support from the people in what's framed as a really critical struggle for national sovereignty.
And it ends with that initial warning again.
It powerfully reiterates it. Health isn't some minor issue. It's potentially a potent tool, a finishing touch that could be used to subdue a nation's sovereignty.
Wow. We've just completed a deep dive into some truly potent source material. A lot to take in there.
Definitely. We've covered everything from that historical context, the personal accounts of alleged confrontations with the WHO,
to specific modern examples like the Wolbachia Bandidos and the TB trials, those highly controversial claims about COVID-19 and the vaccines.
And that incredibly detailed mapping of a claimed global power structure influencing health policy.
Our aim, really, in presenting these perspectives drawn directly from the source material you shared, is to offer you a unique viewpoint, a look into the complexities surrounding national health policy in our, increasingly globalized world.
Understanding these specific claims, the arguments behind them.
Yeah.
It's intended to help you be well-informed, to potentially recognize different angles, different discussions happening around these critical issues.
Exactly. So here is a final thought for you to consider, and this stems directly from the source's core argument. If, As this source claims, a nation's health system can indeed be a potential finishing touch, a tool used to undermine its sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
How does that possibility maybe influence the way we think about international health collaborations or the national health policy choices countries make?
Yeah, what does that perspective suggest about balancing that desire for global health cooperation, which is often necessary,
Okay.
with the fundamental principle of national self-determination, especially when it comes to something as vital as health?
Kita langsung saja dan saya yakin eh, forum ini akan sangat menarik, akan memberikan insight dan pemikiran-pemikiran baru ya mengenai eh, transformasi kesehatan berikutnya. Langsung saja